Hello everybody, nice to have you back. I hope that you and your loved ones are all doing well. Today I want to talk to you about social norms. And social norms are often so obvious that we don't really observe them until something is a little odd. So in this lecture today, we talk about social norms in general, but then we also move on to unpopular norms. These are norms that nobody really wants. So the question becomes, why do we still follow norms that nobody really thinks make any sense? And even more so, why do people enforce norms when they think they don't make any sense as well? So that's the content of the lecture today and the next one. Okay, enjoy the lecture.
Norms. Let's get to norms. Norms are an exciting topic, and they are so much around us. Often we are not really aware of them, and it becomes even more bizarre when we have norms that don't seem to make sense, but they are still there. And it becomes completely crazy when people start to enforce norms that they don't really believe in themselves. So this is sort of like what we're going to talk about today, but then also will continue. Probably this will spill over into Thursday as well. Okay, so let me get first started with social norms. What do we mean by that? Well, one definition could be that social norms are unwritten rules about how to behave. They provide us with an expected idea of how to behave in a particular group, situation, or culture. So it's hardly a law. There's no law that tells me to not tell you to shut the fuck up. Yeah? It's not a law. I won't get expelled from this university. I don't know. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything illegal. Actually, in fact, you don't do anything illegal either. When you kind of sit there and you chat with your neighbors during the lecture, there's no law about that, right? But it's a social norm. It's something that we all seem to agree, that in given certain situations, like here now we're in a lecture situation, you're sitting there, I'm standing there. In fact, it's even physically embedded, you're sitting there, I don't know, going up, I'm standing here in the middle, I'm not standing like this. I could give a lecture like this. Now some people would do that, but that would be really awkward. When you think about it, or actually you can do that, and you can go and try it out in certain social contexts. For example, next time you take the elevator here in the D staircase, just stand in it like this. And see what happens when other people come in. They might find this really awkward. In fact, you might find this really awkward because you don't really know how to deal with this situation. So a social norm is sort of like an unwritten rule in a certain situation about how to behave or how not to behave according to certain groups. And there are other social norms. It's becoming a little ridiculous, but you got the point. There are other social norms. For example, that we have direct eye contact to persons when we're speaking with them. I don't know if you ever met somebody, I don't know, who talks to you, but they never look in your eyes. It's really freaking me out. Yeah? Or another one, you go to the movie theater, and let's say there's only one person sitting there, and you have free choice of seats, and you walk right up next to that person, and you sit next to that person. It's going to freak the hell out of that person. It probably makes you highly uncomfortable. Well, not to pick your nose, I don't know, that's what your parents told you. No, wear clothing. I don't know, I'm not running around in my Speedos right now. Yeah? Say thank you. Actually, it's a very interesting experience that I made when I first came to Ireland. I lived in a couple of countries, and I first come to Ireland, and I'm on the bus, getting to UCD, job interview, and things like that. And there's the bus driver, and there's 20 people walking out in front of me on the bus, and everybody says, thank you, 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 yeah. Thank you. And at some point, I start saying thank you as well. And what's becoming even more interesting that by now, I even sanction the people that don't say thank you to the bus driver. I look at them and look at that rude student. Yeah? That guy has no idea. That's really rude. Even though I didn't really believe in the point of that to begin with, bloody guy is doing his job. Yeah? Of course, I don't know, what is the thing that he didn't crash the bus? Yeah? And I think about the guy. The poor guy has to listen to thank yous thousands of times a day. Yeah? I don't know. The guy must lose his voice. Yeah? It's really fascinating. And you particularly experience and value social norms, so you see them much more when you cross different cultures. Now you have lots of students from different cultural backgrounds. I don't know, you must experience these things here all the time, yeah, about how certain things go, how certain things don't go. Yeah? Or it starts with the funny story. I'm not going to name any names, but I received an email, or I receive emails sometimes, as we do. But sometimes you receive a couple of funny emails. Yeah, you receive unsolicited emails where people just say, "Hey, dude," yeah, or they don't even say, "Hey, dude." They just say, "This doesn't work." You see, there's a norm about how we actually write an email. Yeah? I hope that you guys adhere to it. And, sometimes you don't know better, but, we say hello. Yeah? And then we say goodbye. Yeah? I often say, I hope that you're fine. Yeah? Something like that. But these are all social norms, you see? Or that we pull over for an emergency vehicle, or that we flush the toilet, that we do not talk with food in our mouth. Yeah, so all these kind of different things. So we can talk about different kinds of norms. We can talk about prescriptive norms, which mandate something that we should not do. We can have prescriptive norms that state what we should do. Yeah, for example, I don't know, don't spit on the floors. It's very interesting how historically these things change, and we'll come back to that in a second. Like back in the days, this is, I don't know, Middle Ages, you would have like a feast, yeah? You would, I don't know, kill a goose or whatever one would do, and then you I don't know, grill that thing, yeah, and then you would spit into the corner. That's just what you would do. That would be just completely normal. Yeah? But nowadays we don't do these things anymore. How did that happen? Yeah? How did that come about? We'll come back to that in a second. So social norms are omnipresent in our social, but also in our economic life. When we think about how we kind of deal with others. When you approach the barista, or when you approach a shop, and you say, I don't know, hello. Here you say, oh, isn't the weather great, or is the weather bad? It's like one of those kind of things. Again, in different cultures, it works differently. In Germany, I walk to the bakery, I say, bread. And then the answer is 250. And that's it. That's the conversation. Then the transaction occurs, and then we go our ways, right? Again, it's like a cultural difference. While over here, this wouldn't fly like that. Or, I don't know, it would be extremely rude if you would do that. Right? You say, hello, how are you doing? I don't know, if you don't mind, I wouldn't bother you, I don't know. It would be extremely pleasant if you could pass me on this bread. And so on and so forth. But they also play an important part for how work is organized, how work groups are managed. There are certain norms about how you work together. There are norms, I don't know, how we maintain relations with business partners, or I don't know, but also with our friends, with our relationships, and so on. So the question is, these kind of things are there, undoubtedly. Social norms are there. They're not written down, but they are there. And then the question is, why do we have social norms? Well, it's a legitimate question. It's like one of those questions where you zoom out and you kind of start questioning the big picture. Why do we have social norms? And a perfectly reasonable answer to this question would be because they make sense. Yeah? There's a reason behind that. And these social norms could make sense, or they could be useful, and they could be useful in different ways. You could support that with different arguments. Or with different theories. For example, if you would use functionalist theory, you had that in your intro to sociology class or foundations class. It would be they are useful to the sociology at large. We all benefit from it somehow. Yeah. Or you could say, and one example of that would be, there's a very strong norm. Again, well, there's now a rule about that, a law about that as well. But going back more historically, where there weren't any laws about that, there was a very strong norm about the taboo of incest. Now, why is that? Actually, you could argue because for the society at large, this is actually useful. Why? Because it maintains diversity in the genetic pool. Yeah? Otherwise, I don't know, you inherit genes from both your parents in a way, and then you wouldn't have the diversity anymore. So that would be one of those examples where this is or a functionalist argument that, where something would be useful for the society at large. But you could also have like a conflict theory argument here, that it's social norms are useful for those people who are in power, and that's why they are there. Now these are a lot of like different kind of theories, and I'd like to integrate them so that you see what would these kind of theories say. Not to say that I don't know this is the answer. These theories, they always provide perspectives on certain things. Sometimes a little frustrating, at least for me, to kind of then wonder, so what the fuck is it? Yeah. But conflict theory would say it's norms are useful for dominant groups. And there's a fascinating reading around that by a sociologist called Norbert Elias on the civilization process. Fantastic book. This is the first sociology book I ever read in my life. And it's fascinating because it's like an historical analysis. It looks at how social norms at court, right, at high court, I don't know, at the monarchies and so on, hundreds of years ago, how they evolved and how they changed. And how they changed to the absolute extreme, where the whole day was choreographed about who reaches the king of the water and who is allowed to, I don't know, to brush his hair and how you're supposed to behave at high court. And there, the whole idea behind that is that it sort of maintains the social structure in it. Fascinating reading, but that's sort of like one perspective on social norms. In fact, this reading, Norbert Elias has a whole chapter about how our eating practices changed. How we cut certain food. Before we kind of, just took the leg, of the chicken leg and just biting in it, And nowadays we use fork and knife in these kind of things. It's actually not that old that we started using these things. These are social practices in a way. Okay, there's also a third perspective, this sort of a utilitarian view, which would be folks like Adam Smith and others, which would say that social norms are useful to those who enforce them, for individual people. I kind of enforce a social norm because it helps me. Okay, so far so good. There are different perspectives on why we have social norms. But as I said, it becomes really interesting when we have norms that don't really make sense or that are unpopular. Nobody wants them. Why do we still have unpopular social norms that make no sense? And examples for that would be, there was like a Chinese tradition. Some of you might be aware of it. It went on for hundreds of years. It's like foot binding in China, where little girls' feet would be wrapped around, and then for their whole, adolescence, the foot would be kept like that, so that at the end it would really deform. There's a mutilation of the foot, basically. There was no reason for that, right? But it was sort of like a norm, or it was considered, fashionable or beautiful. But actually, in fact, it was detrimental for the child. At the end, they could hardly walk. They had problems in life and whatnot. Another example of norms that are still present but don't really make a lot of sense is female circumcision in Africa. It's basically violating the genitals of women, cutting it. And again, there's kind of no medical reason behind that. It's not that it increases survival or whatnot, right? But it's sort of there. So again, it's like very detrimental to the people that experience it, but it is there nevertheless. Or a very extreme form, and now I'm using an example for one of the readings that you guys had to use for today, was an instance of mass suicides. So back in the 1970s, there was this instance of Jim Jones with the People's Temple. Basically, it was a cult, like a sect that the guy had founded. And, he moved all his disciples down to Guyana, 1,000 people, where they basically built this new utopia, this colony, and so on and whatnot. And at the end, they all committed mass suicide. It's a crazy story. Read up on it on Google. Great documentaries about this on YouTube. But actually, survivors of that tell the story about how people kind of really felt the social pressure to then commit suicide. Right? So how this went on. It's huge drama at the end of the day. But there, this is like the extreme form where like the norm to commit suicide actually really ends a person's life, even though that person doesn't believe in it. Okay, well, I had a little video about that, but we are running out of time. Sorry, guys. So we're running out of time. So I want to move on to something else. And I want to talk about, this is sort of a long-term project of mine. It's like one of these books that eventually I want to write that you find at the airport. And I already have the title of the book. It's called Leftovers. And essentially what it is about is this idea that there are these social norms and phenomena or practices that are there that used to have a meaning, maybe, but nowadays they don't anymore. But they're still there. Right? So I'm still puzzled when I go to the UK and I constantly have to go from the hot to the cold water tap. Like, didn't we find a technological solution to this yet? If you've ever been to the UK, it's like crazy. On the one side you burn your hand, on the other one you freeze your hand, and then you're supposed to mix them, but it doesn't really fly. It's like really, really difficult. So I'm always struggling with that, but I'm wondering, why the hell is that? There's sort of like, maybe historically there was a reason for that, to have these kind of things, but maybe nowadays they're not there anymore. Or there are lots of other practices, until a few years ago it also was. UK is great for these kind of things, for leftovers. When you would open the door of a train, you would have to open the window and then open the train door from the outside. It's very weird when you think about we're in the 21st century. Why do we still have to do that? But probably for the longest time of railways, this is how you would open the door. And that's sort of like, instilled a certain practice into people, and somehow it's still there. So we do have these things. I'm always at the lookout for these kind of practices, and also, more importantly, why do they survive? And then we kind of move on to actually what we talk at the rest of this lecture and on Thursdays. Why do these norms that don't make sense survive? Why don't they just die out? Why don't they just disappear? So I had a little exercise, but no, let's quickly do that. We have the time, so let's do this exercise. Small little groups, 2, or just think about it by yourself. Identify and discuss with your neighbor one norm that does not seem to make sense anymore, but still exists, and then think about what is the role of social influence in that. Yeah. Okay. So 2 minutes. Okay, guys, let's stop and continue. I had a few interesting examples, and I want to talk now about 2 possibilities or 2 alternative explanations for why social norms are there, even if we don't believe in it. Well, you could argue that humans are group-oriented. We are largely influenced by and conform to peer norms. Other people around you do something, and then you think, well, I don't know, I better do that as well. I might not know why, but let's just do it. And in fact, there's sort of like 2 theoretical ideas behind that. One is called herding, and there is so many others. Cannot be wrong. I'll come back to it in a second. And then we have pluralistic ignorance, which is basically an incorrect assessment of what the majority wants. So herding is this idea, that a herd behavior is highly dependent on the behavior of early movers. Somebody starts doing something, then others follow suit. Right? And sometimes that's a little concerning for some of my sociology colleagues, because they have all these great ideas about why people do what they do, or there they go, and then a person like me comes along and says, but maybe it's just all randomness. Maybe this first sheep just happened to go left. It could have equally gone right. But then social dynamics kick in, and actually that's where the interesting social science happens, in my view. And then social dynamics kicks in, and then the whole thing gets reinforced. So that would be herding behavior, that people follow the crowd and are led to decisions that are sometimes inconsistent with or even contradictory to what they privately believe. So many others cannot be wrong, you just do it, even though you might not see the point of it. And I find myself in these situations all the time when I'm at the airport. Maybe you've been in the same situation. You're sitting at the gate, there's still an hour until your flight goes. Everybody is sitting comfortably. You have your coffee in your hand, listen to Spotify, whatever you do. You sit there, and then this dude comes along, and starts the queue. Yeah? You know what I'm talking about. This dude comes along and starts the queue. And then, within seconds, boom! Everybody jumps up, being afraid that they might lose their spot in the queue. Yeah? And that's kind of really weird, because the flight isn't for another hour. And everybody would have been happier if we would have just sat there for another half an hour, having our coffee, listening to Spotify, doing whatever we do. Just being relaxed. But no, now we have to stand in the bloody queue. Actually, I think it's a fascinating field of research. I want to do some research about this at some point, where I kind of go to the airport and start these queues. And I see what happens. And then walk off. To the next gate. Seriously, there's not any research done on this that I'm aware of. The whole sociology of queuing is a fascinating field. And you know what is the weirdest thing about this? I know about this. I know about herding. I teach about this stuff. And then 5 minutes after everybody kind of jumped and quickly ran to join the queue, I sit there and I find myself being the only guy sitting there. And then I think, oh, let's join the queue. And I do. And then I stand there. It's really bizarre. But that's actually herding. That would be herding behavior. But, fascinating research could be done along the lines of what causes these queues. I don't know. Do they have different effects? And I don't know. How do people react to it? What motivates them? And so on. It's even more bizarre when you think about it back in the days. Actually, I've been observing this for a couple of years. I've been flying around quite a lot in my life. So I've been observing this at many airports. And back in the days, there used to be free seating choice on the Ryanair flights. You remember those days? Yeah. It's like mad. It's like a battle. Yeah? But then I was wondering if the whole point is of choosing who you're going to sit next to. You're so much better off not being the first in the queue. Because when you're the first in the queue, you cannot choose who's going to sit next to you. So it makes even less sense to kind of jump into the queue. Right? Of course, then it becomes more interesting when you have buses. And you could say, okay, you're the first, and you can strategically locate yourself on the bus so that you can jump off the bus first and then run into the airplane. But it still doesn't solve the issue about, I don't know, when you're the first in the airplane, it actually sucks too, in some ways. Anyway, let's talk about the second aspect of it, and that's pluralistic ignorance. So what do we mean by that? So pluralistic ignorance refers to this idea that people in the majority group might wrongly think that they are in the minority. And then they act accordingly. People suppress their dissent and copy the behavior of others who are incorrectly assumed to represent the majority. Basically, you think that everybody else wants to do this. Yeah? And because of that, you follow suit. But in fact, nobody wants it. Right? It was your misperception of others that led you to this behavior. And the classic example in this case is the time of the Prohibition. It was back in the States. The States are, you have to give it to them. They do provide us with interesting stories. And they provided us with Prohibition in the 1920s, where alcohol was deemed illegal. Now, it was a law to sell and buy, produce alcohol. Think about this. It's kind of crazy. But during the time, most people thought that others were for it, for banning alcohol. While in fact, actually, the reality was different. Most people were against prohibition, but nobody spoke up. Or actually, the majority didn't look like the majority. Because people thought that they would get punished if they speak their true opinion or attitude about something. And this also, there's a famous theory in media studies, but also in politics. It's called the spiral of silence by Elisabeth Noelle-Neumann. Maybe you heard about that. It basically touches upon the fact that sometimes small extremist parties seem massively big. Actually, she refers to the Bolsheviks back in, the October Revolution in Russia at the time. They seemed really big, but in fact, it was a really small group. But they were really loud. They were really present. So they looked like they are much more than they actually were. And because of that, other people that were in the opposition didn't really stand up for their opposition. Yeah? So there you see how the misperception of something can then lead for the adoption of a certain behavior, even though the majority doesn't want it, because people wrongly think who the majority is. Right? And then the next one is, then one of my most famous quotes comes into play. Actually, it's one of the reasons why I'm a sociologist. I did something completely else before, but then I kind of realized I have all these ideas, and then I realized at some point it's sociology. And the very core of the very first idea that I had was that it doesn't really matter if you think that something is true or not, as long as you believe in it, it's the same for you in terms of what you make out of it. Yeah? As it turns out, somebody already had that idea 19 years ago. So I was a little late, as I realized, but I thought, okay, I'm on the right track. And the bloody thing is called Thomas theory. Not named after me, but I thought at least it has the right name. It's named after a sociologist from Chicago, William I. Thomas. And as if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences for them. Touches on the idea of pluralistic ignorance. Where does this become relevant? Well, actually, this becomes highly relevant amongst teenagers and drinking behavior. So a couple of studies, or there's one study, I'm going to show you a few results now, where middle and high school students, were sort of like interviewed, and the actual alcohol use in the middle school was around 7%. So 7% of kids in this middle school were drinking alcohol. But in fact, they thought, if you would ask them about how many people drink alcohol, they thought that 23% of the people drink alcohol. So there's a huge discrepancy between what they thought how prevalent alcohol drinking is and what it actually is. Yeah. And in high schools it was the same, it was even like twice the number, so 60% was the perceived use in high school, while the actual use was only 29%. And you can see how this actually then might matter. Because, let's imagine, I don't know, even people did studies on first year or second year university students as well, college students, where, you think that, oh, I need to be drunk, this is the cool thing, yeah? I need to be there. I need to party like crazy because everybody does that. Yeah, I don't want to be the loser that kind of goes home after my tea. Yeah? But in fact, there's the same massive discrepancy because the actual use or the actual preferences of people and what they think what others want and what they think what others use. Some other examples, about alcohol use. Let's skip over that. So the point really is that our behavior is influenced by our perceptions of what others think and do, right? So we think that others do that, and we influence that kind of drives us in some ways. Thomas theory, But then these perceptions might be wrong. They might be inaccurate, right? We might be off on that. And that could lead to certain norms that don't really seem to make sense because we originally perceived them in a wrong way, or we perceived the prevalence of it in a wrong way. So we have a natural tendency to generalize, and we could also perceive that through media. When you nowadays look at, social media, and I hope that you guys are beyond that age where you kind of get too influenced by what some YouTubers say, But this is a very biased perspective on the world. It's a very biased perspective on the world. It's very dangerous when you kind of think about, ideals about body ideals or beauty or something like that. And then you have teenagers going through crazy shit, to match those completely unrealistic expectations that they have, which actually is not really true. Yeah? But it's sort of what is being perceived through, advertising, through culture, through movies, whatnot. Okay. You always surprise me, It's really nice, I give a lecture about how intelligent you are. You can count to 100. I give a lecture about norms. You just play stuff, in the middle of it. It's really nice. Yeah. Thanks for some great stories that I'm going to share. Okay, let's move on. Why would norms persist when they do not make sense or when they are based on these wrong assumptions? Because you could argue that norms are then unstable. They would fall apart. Yeah? At some point, somebody must realize that this doesn't make sense, right? So our networks come into play, and at some point you would argue, okay, we all realize it's a stupid idea to run around in our Speedos when we give the lectures, right? Because it's cold, yeah? And it probably looks a little awkward as well. Okay, so now one suggestion that comes out of the literature, and now we're sort of at the reading that you guys had to do for this week, but then also another one is that norms survive because they are enforced. Right? Some people enforce that. There are these people, like me right now on the bus, who tell others to say thank you to the bus driver. Right? Even though I didn't believe in it in the first instance. And that's actually false enforcement of norms. So it is easy to explain why people comply with unpopular norms, because they might fear social sanctions, and it's easy to explain why people might pressure others to behave the way they want them to behave. But why would people pressure others to behave in a way that they don't want to behave themselves either? But actually, this is exactly what happens. So these phenomena do occur, and we'll talk more about it during the next lecture. So why would people publicly enforce a norm that they secretly would wish go away? So it's not even just that they follow the norm themselves, but they actually enforce that. They make sure that others follow that norm. Yeah? And now we're talking about false enforcement. And then you can talk about, people following, I don't know, some other people that they worship. You actually find that in academia quite a lot. There's a dude, often it's an old dude with a beard. They have these weird ideas. They write incomprehensibly. They talk mumbo jumbo. You have no idea what they're talking about. But somehow, other younger academics follow suit and think, oh, this guy must be so great. Let's worship that guy and follow into that theory, right? Even though they know it doesn't make sense. Or another case where we did observe that were in witch hunts that are luckily over now. But people kind of, they started denouncing others. Others were a witch, even though they knew others were not a witch, because it actually made them look more credible themselves. Or if you've ever been to a modern art gallery, these kind of things can happen to you. That you're kind of standing in front of a beautiful painting like this, and not only do you stand there and look at it, but you kind of look at somebody else who seemingly doesn't understand it, and you think, don't you see it? It's beautiful. It's fantastic. Look at that, right? So other examples, that we have here, for example, gossiping about a social faux pas by snobs, because they want to affirm their cultural sophistication. Very often that happens, where people kind of then, behave in a very snobbish way, and in order to make themselves look better, or the public adoration of a bully by fearful schoolboys who do not want to become the next victim. That's a very practical thing, other potential victims really worshipping the bully because they don't want to be in that victim position at the end of the day. So there are a couple of other examples. So let's have the definition. False enforcement is the public enforcement of a norm by people who privately oppose it. And coming back to our case of college freshmen, of alcohol drinking, there, if you play this through, it would be the following, that, those freshmen, they worry about social acceptance and may be tempted to drink and to celebrate, like really getting drunk and getting wasted. Even though they don't really want that, but they do that because they think it makes them look cool. We've all been in this situation. It's like a human natural thing, especially when we haven't developed our personality yet. So, however, they must not appear to be motivated by this goals, because that would be like really lame. If it would be obvious that you're kind of now doing that in order to please others. Right? So how do you avoid that? Well, actually the best way, and that's sort of what these papers refer to, the best way to avoid that is actually enforcing it, talking others into drinking more. Right? Because by doing so, you actually can sincerely show that you don't just follow that norm to please others. Thus, it is not enough to party. They must also express the belief that drinking is cool and act accordingly, and thereby adding to the social pressure that leads others like them to join. And now we're talking about, what is known as the Emperor's Dilemma, or the Emperor's New Clothes. You might remember children's story where this king, and gets sold some new clothes by a witch, but told that, only the ones that are very intelligent, or only the ones that deserve it can actually see it. Yeah? And then the king, looks at it and thinks, oh shit, I don't see it. Yeah? But I'm king, yeah? I should see it. So he pretends as if he sees it. Yeah? And because he doesn't know better. Yeah? And then he kind of, all the people around him, his ministers and so on, he basically at the end, the guy walks around naked, and all the other ministers say, oh, don't you see the beautiful clothes? They're fantastic. Yeah? Even though they don't see it obviously as well, because there are no clothes. Right? And then the whole thing at some point falters when a little kid comes along and laughs at the naked emperor and says, you're naked. Yeah? And then everybody else says, yeah, I knew it, but I didn't dare to say it. Yeah? Because he's the king. Yeah? And because by saying that I don't see it, I would have showed that I didn't deserve it. I didn't deserve to be around the king. So this is known as the emperor's dilemma, and we'll talk more about that during the next lecture.